At 0714 on May 20th, 1941, the sky over western Crete was already crowded with aircraft. U-52 transport planes droned in formation at 500 meters, their engines echoing off the dry hills near Malemi. Below them, anti-aircraft fire stitched thin black lines through the air. At the rear of one aircraft stood Gefreiter Karl Brenner, age 23, a Fallschirmjäger of the German 7th Flieger Division. He weighed 78 kilograms. His parachute rig weighed another 14. His rifle was not slung across his chest because he did not have one. At 0716, the jump light turned green. At 0717, Brenner stepped into open air. He dropped fast. Wind tore at his smock. His hand searched for the static line. Below him, olive groves and stone walls rushed upward. The descent lasted less than 30 seconds. When he hit the ground at 0718, he rolled hard, came up on one knee, and reached instinctively for a weapon that was not there. The German airborne doctrine of 1941 was built on speed and shock, but it carried a fatal flaw. Paratroopers jumped with pistols, knives, and grenades. Their rifles, machine guns, and ammunition dropped separately in steel containers, often hundreds of meters away. On Crete, British and Commonwealth troops were already waiting. By 0725, Brenner's platoon was pinned down by rifle fire from New Zealand infantry less than 300 meters away. He could hear the crack of Lee Enfields. He could hear men screaming. By 0803, nearly a third of his company was dead or wounded. The Battle of Crete would end in a German victory, but it would cost over 4,000 Fallschirmjäger casualties in just 10 days. For the airborne arm of the Wehrmacht, it was a strategic success and a tactical disaster. The lesson was brutally clear. Elite troops landing behind enemy lines could not afford to fight as lightly armed infantry. Within weeks, that lesson reached Berlin. On June 4, 1941, at 10:40, a meeting convened at the German Air Ministry. Present were officers from the Luftwaffe, engineers from Rheinmetall-Borsig, and representatives of the Fallschirmjäger Command. The directive was specific. Paratroopers needed a single weapon that could replace the bolt-action rifle, the submachine gun, and the light machine gun. It had to fire a full-power rifle cartridge, the 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser, because airborne units might have to fight at ranges exceeding 600 meters. It had to be capable of automatic fire because landing zones were chaotic and often contested. It had to be short enough to jump with. It had to accept optics, and it had to be controllable. No existing weapon met those requirements. At 11:02, the project received a designation, Fallschirmjägergewehr 42. The men tasked with designing the rifle understood the constraints immediately. The standard Carabiner 98K weighed 4.1 kilograms unloaded and required manual cycling. The MP40 was compact but limited to 9 by 19 mm pistol ammunition, effective inside 150 meters. The MG34 provided firepower but weighed over 12 kilograms with bipod and ammunition. The new weapon could not simply combine features, it had to reimagine the infantry rifle. By August 1942, Rheinmetall-Borsig engineers produced the first functional prototypes. They were unconventional. The receiver was milled steel. The magazine fed from the left side to allow a prone shooter to stay low. The barrel was free-floating, 500 millimeters long. The rifle fired from a closed bolt in semi-automatic mode for accuracy and from an open bolt in automatic to reduce heat buildup. Unloaded weight, approximately 4.2 kilograms. Cyclic rate, roughly 750 rounds per minute. Magazine capacity, 20 rounds. It was not quiet, it was not cheap, but it was unlike anything fielded by any army in the world. At 0750 on December 2, 1942, a Fallschirmjäger training company assembled at a proving ground near Tarnowitz. Among them was Brenner, now promoted to Obergefreiter, transferred back from convalescence after a shrapnel wound to the thigh sustained on Crete. At 0705, instructors issued the new rifles. Brenner noticed the balance immediately. The recoil impulse traveled straight back into the shoulder instead of upward. The sights sat high above the bore. The bipod folded tight under the barrel. The weapon felt alive in his hands, heavy but purposeful. At 0742, he fired his first group at 300 meters. 5 rounds, semi-automatic, prone. The dispersion was tighter than his old Kar 98K. At 0811, the instructor ordered automatic fire. Brenner leaned into the stock and squeezed. The rifle climbed, but not violently. Dust kicked up along the target line. The barrel heated fast. After 3 magazines, the handguard was too hot to touch. By 0830, the verdict was cautious respect. This rifle could do things others could not. The FG-42 entered limited service in early 1943, issued almost exclusively to Fallschirmjäger units. Fewer than 7,000 would ever be produced across all variants. The reasons were industrial as much as tactical. Each rifle required extensive machining. Each one consumed materials Germany could barely spare by mid-war. But where it appeared, it changed the fight. At 2:18 on September 12, 1943, Brenner lay prone on a rocky slope above Gran Sasso, Italy. Below him stood the Campo Imperatore Hotel. Inside, Benito Mussolini was being held prisoner. Operation Ike was underway. The assault force landed by glider at 2:05 p.m. Brenner's role was overwatch. His FG-42 was fitted with a 4X ZF-4 optic. Range to the nearest carabinieri position, 220 meters. At 2:21, an Italian guard broke cover and ran. Brenner tracked him. He exhaled. He fired once. The guard fell. No bolt to cycle, no shift in position. Brenner stayed on the scope. The mission ended without a prolonged firefight, but moments like that reinforced what the weapon represented. A single paratrooper could now deliver accurate fire at distance and suppress an enemy position without waiting for machine guns to arrive. For the Fallschirmjäger, the rifle reduced vulnerability in the first minutes after landing, the most dangerous phase of any airborne operation. Yet the FG-42 was not a miracle weapon. Its recoil in automatic fire remained difficult to control. Magazines emptied quickly. Spare parts were scarce. Training time was limited. Many units never received enough rifles to standardize their use. Still, the concept mattered more than the numbers. By late 1944, Allied intelligence reports noted the weapon's unusual configuration. Post-war weapons designers would study captured examples closely. They would see the inline stock, the dual-mode firing system, the integration of optics as standard, not accessory. They would not copy it directly, but they would remember it. By May 1945, Brenner surrendered near Salzburg. His FG-42 had been destroyed 2 days earlier, smashed against a rock to keep it out of enemy hands. He survived the war. The rifle did not, but its influence did. The idea that one infantryman could carry a single weapon capable of precision, suppression, and adaptability had been proven under fire. The world's armies would spend the next decades trying to perfect that idea. The FG-42 was rare, it was expensive, it was flawed, and it marked a turning point.
War documentary. By 0630 on January 22, 1944, Brenner was no longer fighting as an airborne assault trooper. He was now assigned to a Fallschirmjäger regiment holding defensive positions south of Cassino. The role of German paratroopers had changed. There were no more large-scale jumps. Fuel shortages, Allied air superiority, and mounting losses had grounded the Luftwaffe's transport fleet. The Fallschirmjäger now fought as elite infantry. The terrain around Cassino was unforgiving. Steep ridgelines, broken stone villages, sparse cover. Observation distances frequently exceeded 800 meters. Artillery dominated movement. Infantry survived by digging deep and staying still. At 0712, Brenner crawled into a shallow firing position overlooking a dry ravine. His FG-42 rested on its bipod. The barrel was cold. He carried 6 magazines, 120 rounds total. Each magazine weighed nearly a kilogram when loaded. Ammunition discipline mattered. At 0729, Allied artillery began falling on the slopes behind him. High explosive, air burst. The concussion traveled through the ground and into his chest. At 0741, the first American infantry elements appeared, moving cautiously, squads spaced at 10-meter intervals. Brenner watched through his optic. He counted helmets. He waited. At 0744, he fired. The FG-42 cracked sharply. One man fell. Another dropped prone. Brenner shifted his aim 40 centimeters left and fired again. The rifle stayed steady. No bolt manipulation, no loss of sight picture. At 0747, he switched to automatic fire and raked a rock outcrop where a BAR team had taken cover. Dust and stone chips exploded outward. The Americans pulled back. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. By 0802, Brenner had fired 37 rounds. The position held. This was the environment the FG-42 had been built for. Not dramatic airborne assaults, but fluid, small-unit combat, where a single rifleman could dictate space and tempo. The weapon's design reflected that philosophy. The inline stock reduced muzzle rise. The elevated sights accommodated optics without compromising iron sight use. The side-mounted magazine kept the shooter low in the prone position, though it unbalanced the rifle when firing offhand. Every advantage came with a trade-off. The rifle's thin barrel overheated rapidly. Automatic fire was effective only in short bursts. Sustained fire risked warping the barrel or cooking off rounds. Unlike a true light machine gun, the FG-42 could not dominate ground for extended periods. It was a precision instrument, not a bullet hose. On February 15, 1944, at 0930, Allied bombers struck Monte Cassino itself. Over 1,400 tons of explosives flattened the monastery. The rubble created new defensive positions almost instantly. German paratroopers moved back into the ruins by 11 a.m. Brenner was among them. At 12:18, he engaged targets inside shattered stone corridors no wider than 2 meters. The FG-42's length, just under a meter, proved manageable. He fired semi-automatic almost exclusively. Distances ranged from 15 to 70 meters. The heavy rifle cartridge punched through masonry fragments and improvised cover. At 12:41, a grenade detonated nearby. Brenner's hearing went dull. He kept firing. At 13:05, his magazine ran dry mid-engagement. Reloading from the left side was slower under stress. He adapted, rolling slightly onto his right shoulder, seating the magazine by feel. This was not a weapon for poorly trained troops. It rewarded discipline. It punished mistakes. By March 1944, Brenner had been promoted to Unteroffizier. His role shifted again. He was now responsible for training replacements, young men with minimal combat experience. Teaching them the FG-42 was a challenge. Spare rifles were few. Ammunition was rationed. Manuals lagged behind field modifications. He taught them fundamentals: semi-automatic fire first, burst control second, automatic fire only when necessary. He taught them to manage heat, to count rounds, to clean the gas system meticulously, to treat the rifle not as a machine gun, but as a precision tool capable of sudden violence. Many did not survive long enough to master it. On June 1944, Allied landings in Normandy forced German High Command to reallocate elite units north. Brenner's regiment was withdrawn piecemeal. Transport was chaotic. Rail lines were bombed. Units moved mostly at night. At 22:10 on July 3rd, Brenner arrived outside Saint-Lô. The front was fluid. Hedges limited visibility to under 30 meters. The FG-42 was less suited to this environment. Its length caught on vegetation. Its recoil was harder to manage in rapid close-range encounters. Brenner adapted again. He removed the optic. He relied on iron sights. He kept the selector on semi-automatic. At 05:45 on July 11th, an American patrol stumbled into his section's position. The firefight lasted less than a minute. Brenner fired 8 rounds. 2 men fell. The rest withdrew. The rifle did its job. Behind the lines, German engineers were already looking beyond the FG-42. The war had exposed the limits of full-power rifle cartridges in automatic weapons. Intermediate calibers offered better control. The Sturmgewehr 44 represented another path forward, lighter, simpler, easier to mass-produce. The FG-42 occupied an awkward space between eras, too advanced for Germany's collapsing industry, too specialized for widespread adoption, but its concepts endured. In April 1945, Brenner retreated into Bavaria. Fuel was gone, air support non-existent. The war's end was no longer theoretical. At 1640, on April 28th, he received orders to destroy all sensitive equipment. Radios first, documents second, weapons last. He hesitated over the FG-42. At 1592, he smashed the receiver against a rock. The optic shattered, the bolt jammed, the rifle was finished. At 1710, he walked away. After the war, Brenner spent 3 years in captivity. He was released in 1948. He became a machinist. He never owned another firearm. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he spoke about training, not ideology, about equipment, not politics. The FG-42 became a footnote to most people, a rare collector's item, a curiosity in museums. But to weapons designers, it remained a case study. Captured examples influenced American engineers working on the M60 machine gun, which adopted the FG-42's bolt and gas system lineage. The idea of an inline stock and integrated optics reappeared decades later in modern battle rifles and designated marksman systems. The FG-42 did not change the outcome of the war. It changed how soldiers thought about what one rifleman could do. The rifle emerged from disaster. It was forged in response to failure. It never reached its full potential, but it pointed forward, towards a future where infantry weapons would no longer be defined by a single role: sniper, rifleman, automatic gunner. The FG-42 tried to be all three, and in doing so, it reshaped infantry warfare forever.
War documentary. At 900 hours on October 14, 1952, in a quiet testing hall at Springfield Armory, Massachusetts, a group of American engineers examined a disassembled German rifle laid out on a steel workbench. The rifle was incomplete. Its wood furniture had been replaced. Its finish was worn, but its internal geometry was unmistakable. An FG-42. The men in the room were not studying it as a relic. They were studying it as a solution. Post-war U.S. infantry doctrine faced a familiar problem. World War II had demonstrated that the standard rifleman needed more firepower than a bolt-action rifle, but that traditional light machine guns were too heavy and too slow to maneuver.
The American M1918 bar was reliable, but at over 8.8 kilograms loaded, it was a burden. The German MG-42 was devastating, but crew-served. The FG-42 occupied the space between. Its rotating bolt system, its gas piston layout, its inline stock, these were not copied wholesale, but they were adapted. By 1957, those design principles would resurface in the M60 general-purpose machine gun. The M60's bolt and operating rod traced a clear lineage back to German wartime engineering. American designers acknowledged it privately, if not always publicly. The FG-42's influence had crossed the Atlantic. Meanwhile, Brenner was rebuilding a life in a divided Germany. By 1955, he was 37 years old, married with 2 children. He worked in a tool and die shop near Stuttgart. The work was precise, measured, predictable. He found comfort in that. Precision had kept him alive once. It kept him employed now. He followed military developments from a distance: West Germany's rearmament, the creation of the Bundeswehr, the adoption of the G3 rifle, a roller-delayed blowback design firing the same 7.62 by 51 mm cartridge used by NATO. Different philosophy, same problem. How much power could one soldier control? At 11:20 on June 3, 1961, a Bundeswehr training exercise took place outside Münster. Young soldiers fired their G3s on full automatic. The results were predictable: muzzle climb, wide dispersion, ammunition wasted. The lessons echoed those learned 2 decades earlier. Full-power cartridges and automatic fire were a difficult marriage. The future would belong to compromise. That compromise emerged fully in the late Cold War: assault rifles firing intermediate cartridges, selective fire, optics issued as standard rather than exception. Infantry squads built around flexibility instead of rigid weapon roles. By the 1990s, designated marksman rifles appeared, bridging the gap between sniper and rifleman. Sound familiar? The FG-42 had attempted this in 1942. It had simply arrived too early. At 1400 hours on May 8, 1985, Brenner stood in a small military museum in Munich. On display behind glass was an FG-42, Type II model. The placard listed technical specifications: weight, caliber, production numbers. It did not list the men who had carried it. He stood there for several minutes. He did not touch the glass. He did not speak. At 14:07, he turned and walked away. The FG-42's rarity gave it an almost mythic status among collectors and historians. Surviving examples became highly valued. Each one represented not just engineering ambition, but a doctrinal experiment conducted under extreme conditions. The rifle demonstrated that infantry weapons could be modular before the term existed, that optics were not luxuries, that one soldier could shift from precision to suppression without changing weapons. Modern armies would embrace those ideas fully, just not in time to matter for Germany. From Crete to Cassino, from Gran Sasso to Normandy, the FG-42 followed the trajectory of the Fallschirmjäger themselves: elite, overextended, and ultimately consumed by a war of attrition they were never designed to fight. It was not a wonder weapon. It did not win battles on its own, but it changed the questions militaries asked. What should one soldier carry? What should one weapon do? Those questions still shape infantry warfare today. By 1999, Brenner was 81 years old. He died quietly, without ceremony. No obituary mentioned Crete or Cassino or the rifle that had defined his war. But the FG-42 endured, in design textbooks, in museums, in the DNA of modern firearms. A rifle born from failure, a weapon that pointed forward.
At 8:30 on March 18, 2006, a U.S. Army platoon moved through the outskirts of Ramadi, Iraq. Each soldier carried a modular rifle equipped with optics, adjustable stocks, and accessory rails. One man in the squad, the designated marksman, carried a heavier variant with magnified glass. His role was to reach farther, hit harder, and suppress when needed. He was not a sniper. He was not a machine gunner. He was something in between. The concept was no longer experimental. It was doctrine. The FG-42's legacy did not survive because of numbers. Fewer than 7,500 rifles were produced across all variants. Many were lost in combat. Others were destroyed at war's end. Unlike the Sturmgewehr 44, it never achieved symbolic recognition as a first of its kind. Instead, its influence moved quietly, through engineering decisions, design philosophies, and tactical reconsiderations. The inline recoil system, intended to reduce muzzle climb, became standard in later rifles. The acceptance of optics as integral to infantry combat, not specialist equipment, became universal. The understanding that suppressive fire and precision could coexist in one weapon reshaped squad-level tactics. These were not incremental changes. They were conceptual shifts. In 1958, U.S. Army evaluations of the M14 rifle revealed familiar problems. Automatic fire was largely uncontrollable. Ammunition loads were heavy. Fire superiority depended increasingly on machine guns and supporting arms. The lesson repeated itself. Designers returned to the same dilemma faced by German engineers in 1941: how to give individual soldiers flexibility without burdening them. The eventual answer was not a single rifle firing a full-power cartridge. It was specialization within a flexible system. Assault rifles for volume, designated marksman rifles for reach, machine guns for dominance. But all of them carried echoes of the same question the FG-42 had tried to answer alone. By the early 21st century, modern infantry rifles weighed roughly the same as the FG-42 had 6 decades earlier, around 4 kilograms. They were lighter in recoil, easier to maintain, simpler to manufacture. Their optics were superior, their materials more forgiving, but their role was strikingly similar. One soldier, one weapon, multiple tasks. Museums today present the FG-42 behind glass, often labeled as advanced, experimental, or ahead of its time. These descriptions are accurate, but incomplete. The rifle was not just advanced, it was reactive. It was born from the bloodshed of Crete, from the realization that courage and training could not compensate for inadequate equipment. It was designed by men under pressure, working against time, resources, and an industrial system already strained by total war. Its flaws were real. Its ambitions were greater. The FG-42 failed to change the course of World War II. Germany's defeat was determined by factors far beyond small arms innovation. But infantry warfare does not evolve only through victories. It evolves through adaptation, often forced, often costly. The FG-42 was adaptation made steel. Today, its silhouette still looks modern. Straight-line stock, elevated sights, purpose-built geometry. It does not resemble a relic from the 1930s. It resembles a prototype from the future. That is why it endures, not as a symbol of power, not as a wonder weapon, but as a reminder that the most important military innovations often come from recognizing failure and refusing to repeat it. The Fallschirmjägers learned that lesson over Crete. Engineers turned it into a rifle, and the rest of the world learned from it quietly over decades.